Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Monday, the 1st of May. First of all, where did the first 4 months of the year go? I've lost them. I just want to talk to you today. It's not morose, I promise, but I want to talk to you about funerals. Um, as a priest, I've been doing this for almost 24 years. The anniversary of my ordination to the diaconate is in 2 weeks, the 13th of May. But so I've been doing funerals for 24 years. And one thing I have noticed as I get older is more and more people, if they come to me because somebody in their family has died and they have to plan the funeral, they have no idea what to do. So I sit down with, do you want the old book or the new book? Well, I don't know which one. So I say the new book because the theology in the new book of the Anglican Church is so much more hope-filled and resurrection-filled. And then we talk about music and, well, I don't know, like what's that song about an old cross, the old rugged cross, or Amazing Grace? And people often have no idea when I ask them about, is there any music you want to have, or prayers, or scripture? Oh, I ask people if what scripture they want to have for their parents' funeral, and they have no clue. What's that psalm or that piece of scripture about like a shepherd and walking beside his enemies or something? 23rd Psalm. So the thing is, I have a practical request of you. I really do. Think about how you want to be remembered. Think about how you want your life celebrated. Now, I am not suggesting you have to have a church service or a communion service or anything like that. But what I am suggesting is maybe, while you're still able to do it yourself, is to sort of sit down and think, what's important to me? What kinds of things are important to me in my life? And how would I like this to happen? Now, just a caveat to this. Um, 9 times out of 10, when someone has been very specific about, this is what I want, music I want here, my pallbearers, and I want all these things, it doesn't go that way. And the fact is, the person's gone, so they're not going to come back and, get mad at me for not doing it that way. But usually there's a reason. Somebody in the family, doesn't like this, or somebody has, well, grandma really liked this song, and I don't remember her ever singing that one, so we'll use this one instead. And the fact is that the funeral or the memorial service is really for the people who are here, for those who are mourning, for those who are remembering. So if you can do the work of preparing what you would like to have happen, and then big thing is let people know where your instructions are. It's like always let people know where your will is or your power of attorney, things like that, because the worst thing that can happen is when someone's caught in the depths of grieving and there's just a million and one questions that professionals are asking in the first 48 hours, and it's like, I don't have a clue, and they're not thinking straight. So make sure if you have a will or a power of attorney or any specific instructions, put them someplace that makes sense. Like in your freezer makes sense, because if your house burns down, they're still going to be there. Probably be safe. But who's going to think of looking in the freezer when, grandma just died? So make a place that makes good common sense, and then tell people where it is. Tell family and friends. Tell somebody maybe who's not so close to you, your best friend or your neighbor, so if something does happen, they don't have the emotional stuff going on, that they could come and say, oh, you know what? Your mom wanted me to remind you that her will and all of her instructions are in the top drawer of the filing cabinet in a file that says gotcha or funeral or whatever you want. Depends on the sense of humor of the person. But just make it easy for people to find the information. When we do this, when we actually sit down and have these conversations with somebody else, it could be with your priest or your rabbi or your imam, it could be with a good friend or a coworker, it could be, with your kids, it could be something off the internet. When we actually sit down and have these conversations or make these decisions, it actually helps us prepare ourselves, and helps people to prepare for the eventuality of their own death. Because the fact is, death and taxes are pretty much the only things that are stable in the world. We all have to pay taxes, and we are all going to die. And that doesn't have to be morose, and it doesn't have to be difficult. If you think about what you would like to have done, for instance, big question, families are very, and this becomes an emotional thing. So Mrs. McGillicuddy has died, and Mrs. McGillicuddy's son and her daughter are sitting down at the funeral home to talk about what happens next. And the funeral home director says, would you like to have, is she going to be buried in a casket, or did she wish to be cremated? And Mrs. McGillicuddy's daughter is completely like, ugh, about the idea of cremation. She's like, absolutely casket. And yet Mrs. McGillicuddy's son said, well, Mom and I talked about that last summer when I was home, and she really does want to be cremated, and then just buried in with Dad's casket. Okay, what happens then? Hopefully the funeral director is very pastoral and kind, but you now have two children grieving their mother who are making decisions or trying to make a decision, and they're at odds with each other. One says he knows what Mom wanted, and the other one knows this is what I think, and I think that it's really evil and cruel to stick a stick Mom's body in a furnace and come up with remains. Tough decision, isn't it? But if you make that decision for yourself, if you, and especially if you talk to your children or your loved ones about that decision and say to them, I've thought this through and I know what I would like, and this is why I would like it. And I've written it down and it's right here. Better yet, everything's paid for at the funeral home and they know exactly what I want. It's all in a file. But to have those conversations ahead of time really takes the burden off the people who have to make those decisions for you. And it also gives you the opportunity to make that decision for yourself. Same thing comes with your service. Do you want there to be scripture? And of course, as a priest, I always, if you're going to do a service with me, you're going to have scripture. I will read it. I'll preach about it. You don't have to do anything with it, but I'm going to give it to you because it's me that you're asking for me to be your present for your funeral. You're inviting God into it. So I'm going to bring God all the way. But I've been at funerals where it's been, poetry and music. I was at I did a funeral where we actually had some Metallica and some Def Leppard and what was it? It was a very, very heavy metal group that were referenced in the sermon. And then as we walked into the church, one of those songs was being played. Was it liturgically appropriate and Christian? Absolutely not. Did it help everybody in the congregation feel like the person who had died was with them for one last moment? Did it make them feel like we're honoring him? Absolutely. And at the end of the day, God has already received them home. And that's what I believe, that whoever's died is already with God. And they're like, they get it. They get the great irony of all the things that we do on earth that we can't possibly understand. So I think God just like says, yeah, let them do it. Let them have at it. I remember the best, like I've had so many great funerals. It sounds really weird to say that, but so many really powerful and beautiful sermon funerals. And one of them I had was for a young woman named Jen. And Jen was intellectually disabled, and she belonged to a group of people called the Club in Halifax. And it was a group of people who had Down syndrome and were on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. And a lot of them had physical disabilities as well as intellectual disabilities. And they were an incredible group of people. And her twin brother he worked for the club. She was a participant and he worked there. And he and two of his friends got up and they gave the eulogy. They talked about Jen. And one of Jen's things was she would go up to everybody and say, "You are so sexy." And Jen was about, I'm 5'10", so Jen would be about 5'6", and she was a beautiful black woman. And I think she was about 32, but she had the vivaciousness and the innocence of maybe a 14 or 15-year-old girl. And she would talk, "You are so sexy." She'd say that to anybody. It was like a compliment. It was her way of saying, "I love you, and I'm glad you're in my life, and I'm glad you're in my space right now. You are so sexy." And they got up there and they talked about that. These three guys who were like really handsome young dudes standing up there talking to this huge congregation, church packed with people, talking about Jen would walk up and say, "You're so sexy." It was incredible. And then I'm gonna cry. I did the eulogy or I did the sermon, and instead of wearing white, which we always wear for funerals, white of resurrection, I was wearing my blue stole. It was during Advent, and we were talking. I had gone to talk to the members of the club, and we were talking about new life and celebration of Jen. They got it better than any of the adults ever. The intellectually mainstream people, those people at the club, they got it. They understood what happened to Jen and where she was. And I had a firefly on my stole, on my blue Advent stole. And they had been hearing a story about the firefly and how it was a beetle who went down into the water and it died. And when it came back to life, it came back as a firefly, not a firefly, a dragonfly. And I had this dragonfly on my stole. So I decided I was going to wear my blue stole instead of my white one because it had that dragonfly. And for them, it represented new life. And so we finished my sermon, and then they had asked if they could do, two of the leaders could come up and sing one of Jen's favorite songs. So they came up with their guitars, and they were really great singers, and they were singing away. And all of a sudden, a couple more people from the club came up. And then there were 30 people in my church with these people playing guitars, and there was a mosh pit in my church in the middle of a funeral for Jen. And all these old people and people from not from the club and people who knew the family and knew people affected were all, I thought, oh, they're going to be horrified. And the looks on people's faces, it was beautiful because these were people who knew they weren't heavy burdened with the realities of life because they knew what life was in the best sense. And they were celebrating Jen, and they were screaming their heads off and saying, yelling out, "You're so sexy!" And they were singing the song that Jen would have loved to be there singing with them, and it was incredible. And then we did the prayers of the people, and we went to leave, and the song was a Boys to Men song, and the whole group was singing it. And we walked her casket out of the church, and we took it to the hearse, and not one person didn't have a tear in their eye, but they were all tears of joy because we had celebrated Jen's life the way Jen would have wanted to be celebrated, the way she would have celebrated if she could have been standing there with us. Those people knew what Jen would have wanted, and they knew that what Jen would have wanted would give them hope and peace. And so they did that. When we take the time to sit down and figure out what we want, how we would like ourselves to be remembered, we filter in, we allow room for other people to have their own memories and to put what they need into our liturgies or our remembrances, our memorials. But it also gives them the gift of knowing that we plan this together. They may be adding things after the fact, but they are doing something with the person who has died. And there's a sense of relief that they don't have to do it all by themselves. So I really do encourage you to figure out what it is that you want when you're gone. How do you want to be remembered? How do you want to be celebrated? And please, please don't say that you don't want anything, because there will be at least one person in your life and they need to celebrate you. So this, as ridiculous as this sounds, when you sit down to make these plans, try not to be selfish. Try to remember that these plans are not really for you because you will already be up there. You don't have to worry about them. These are plans for the people who love you. And you're giving them the gift of sharing with them what you would like and relieving them of the pressure of having to make all these decisions by themselves so that they can have a mosh pit at your funeral and they can yell out, "You're so sexy," or they can leave to Boys to Men, or they can leave to Mozart and a grand piano, or an opera singer, or a country, Ricky Van Shelton or Alan Jackson singing the old rugged cross, whatever it is that brings peace and healing. So please, I do ask you to consider, think about your end of life decisions and how you want those things to go, and then share them with people. Be open about that. I know it can be hard, but it can also be an incredibly beautiful thing to do. And remember, as Jen said, you are sexy. Have a great day and God bless you.